Forget everything you think you know about the current state of NATO's eastern defenses. What happened at 0347 hours Central European time this morning is not a tactical strike. It is not a warning shot. It is the complete erasure of NATO's integrated command and control architecture for Eastern Europe, executed with a weapons system that every single military analyst in Washington told you could be intercepted. Let me be very clear about something the Pentagon is desperately hoping you will not understand before the news cycle moves on. A Russian Kinzhal-M hypersonic aeroballistic missile traveling at Mach 12 obliterated the primary NATO Joint Force Command facility located beneath Ramstein Air Base in southwestern Germany. Not a peripheral logistics depot, not a forward observation post, the actual nerve center coordinating every NATO air defense battery, every rapid reaction force, and every intelligence fusion cell from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Having spent decades in military intelligence, having sat in rooms where men with more stars on their shoulders than you can count discussed exactly these scenarios, having analyzed Soviet and now Russian weapons development programs since the Cold War never actually ended, I'm telling you what the sanitized press briefings will not. This was a decapitation strike. The target selection, the timing, the weapon system employed, everything about this operation was designed to demonstrate that NATO's most protected command infrastructure exists only because Russia permits it to exist. And that permission just got revoked in the most spectacular and terrifying manner possible. The Ramstein facility sits 60 meters underground, hardened against nuclear near-miss scenarios, protected by overlapping layers of Patriot PAC-3 batteries, NASAMS installations, and the theoretical umbrella of NATO's integrated air defense network. Theoretical. That word matters now more than it ever has, because at 0347 this morning, a weapon traveling faster than anything NATO possesses the capacity to track in terminal phase came through the roof of that bunker complex like it was tissue paper. The kinetic energy alone, never mind any explosive payload, turned reinforced concrete and steel into superheated plasma. Early casualty estimates, the ones they are not putting in official statements, range from 600 to 800 personnel. But if you think this is about body count, you have fundamentally misunderstood what just occurred. Stay with me because what I am about to walk you through is not speculation. This is pattern recognition built on 40 years of watching how Russia actually prosecutes military operations when gloves come off. The Kinzhal-M, and I need you to understand this designation matters, is not the Kinzhal system that entered service in 2018. The M variant incorporates terminal guidance upgrades, enhanced penetration warhead geometry, and most critically, maneuvering capability in the final 15 seconds of flight that makes the physics of interception not difficult, but impossible with current NATO systems. The missile launches from a MiG-31K interceptor flying at 18,000 meters and Mach 2, giving it a boost phase velocity that transitions immediately into hypersonic glide. Range exceeds 2,000 kilometers in this configuration. Circular error probable, the radius within which 50% of strikes will land is under 3 meters with terminal optical guidance active. Let me walk you through exactly what NATO air defense operators saw on their screens in the 180 seconds they had before impact. First, radar returns consistent with a MiG-31 launching from somewhere over Kaliningrad airspace. Standard intercept protocols would be initiated. Threat assessment would note the platform is capable of carrying Kinzhal, but actual launch confirmation requires different sensor signatures. By the time those sensors registered a ballistic trajectory developing, the missile was already transitioning through Mach 8 in boost phase. Patriot engagement envelopes top out at targets moving Mach 5. NASAM systems are optimized for cruise missiles and aircraft, not hypersonic ballistic threats. The Aegis Ashore installation in Romania, theoretically capable of exo-atmospheric intercepts, was positioned to defend against Iranian missile threats from the south, not Russian launches from the northeast. Geometry matters in missile defense. The geometry this morning was perfect for the attacker and catastrophic for the defender. What you need to understand about hypersonic weapons is that speed is only one dimension of the problem. The Kinzhal-M in terminal phase executes random walk maneuvering using lateral thrusters that can generate up to 30 g acceleration shifts. A Patriot Pass-3 interceptor, our best answer to this class of threat, can pull maybe 40 g in optimal conditions, but requires predictable target trajectory to compute intercept solution. When your target is randomly stepping left, right, up, down every 2 seconds while traveling 7 kilometers per second, the math does not close. The intercept window does not exist. This is not about better technology or more funding or improved training. This is physics. And physics just demonstrated that NATO's trillion-dollar air defense infrastructure cannot stop a determined Russian strike on any target Moscow selects. Before we go any further, I need you to understand the institutional dimensions of what was housed in that Ramstein facility. This was not some satellite office running administrative functions. The Joint Force Command Brunsum relocated to Ramstein for hardening purposes after Ukraine escalations began, coordinated 14 separate national command elements, integrated air tasking orders for the entire eastern flank, managed the intelligence fusion cell that processes every single piece of reconnaissance data from Baltic reconnaissance flights to Black Sea drone operations, and housed the crisis action team that would execute Article 5 collective defense procedures if invoked. That capability no longer exists. The backup facilities in Mons, Belgium, and Northwood, UK are not equivalents. They lack the hardened communications architecture, the redundant power systems, and frankly, the institutional knowledge that just got vaporized, along with everyone who was in that operations center when the Kinzhal came through. The immediate tactical consequences are already manifesting, and they are catastrophic. Every NATO air defense battery from Estonia to Romania just lost its central coordination node. They still have local commanders. They still have radars and missiles, but the integrated fire control, the deconfliction protocols that prevent friendly fire incidents, the common operational picture that lets a Patriot battery in Poland see what a NASAM site in Lithuania is tracking, that network just went dark. NATO air defense in Eastern Europe has regressed to 1980s capability levels where each site operates on local information only. The degradation in effectiveness is not incremental. It is an order of magnitude collapse. A Russian strike package that NATO's integrated network could have defeated with 80% confidence now faces maybe 30% interception probability. And every Russian operational planner in Moscow knows it. Keep watching, because the next part is where everything starts to unravel on timescales that should terrify anyone paying attention. Russia did not execute this strike in isolation. Intelligence assessments coming out of channels I still maintain, and yes, I still have those conversations with people who would rather remain unnamed, indicate this was phase one of a coordinated operation. Simultaneous with the Ramstein strike, Russian electronic warfare systems across Kaliningrad and Belarus initiated broad-spectrum jamming of NATO satellite communications, GPS navigation signals, and the Link 16 data network that connects NATO aircraft and ground systems. The jamming began at exactly 3:47, synchronized to the second with Kinzhal impact. That is not coincidence. That is operational coordination indicating pre-planned sequencing designed to blind NATO's eyes while its brain is still reeling from the decapitation strike. What the mainstream media will not tell you is what this targeting decision reveals about Russian intelligence penetration of NATO command structures. To hit that specific facility with that precision requires detailed knowledge of bunker construction, exact GPS coordinates of the most vulnerable entry points, and real-time confirmation that senior personnel were present to maximize the operational and psychological impact. We are not talking about satellite imagery analysis. We are talking about human intelligence sources inside NATO operational planning cells, providing Moscow with access to information that should be protected at the highest classification levels. The counterintelligence implications alone will paralyze NATO internal security for months as they try to identify how deep the compromise extends. And while they are busy with that witch hunt, operational effectiveness continues degrading. Let me tell you what this really means in the context of European security architecture that has persisted since 1949. NATO's entire Eastern deterrence posture rests on exactly two pillars. First, the assumption that Article 5 collective defense obligations are credible and will be executed if any member state is attacked. Second, the assumption that NATO's technological superiority, particularly in air defense and precision strike, creates cost-imposing dilemmas for Russia that make large-scale aggression irrational. This morning's strike invalidated the second assumption completely. When Russia can hit the most hardened NATO command facility in Europe with a weapon system NATO cannot intercept, every single calculation about escalation dynamics and deterrence credibility just changed. The Baltic states, Poland, Romania, they are watching this and asking themselves a very simple question. If NATO cannot protect its own central command bunker on German soil, how exactly is it going to protect Tallinn or Warsaw or Bucharest when Russian missile salvos start flying? You think you have heard the worst of it. You have not, not even close. The casualty count, however tragic, is tactical noise. What matters strategically is the decision calculus this creates for both NATO and Russia in the next 72 to 96 hours. NATO faces an impossible choice. Option 1, acknowledge the strike publicly, which requires explaining to European populations that their air defense umbrella just failed catastrophically and that hundreds of NATO personnel died on German soil in what is functionally an act of war. That acknowledgement triggers political chaos across European capitals and potentially fractures the alliance as populations demand their governments withdraw from forward deployments that clearly cannot be protected. Option 2, suppress or minimize the incident, claim it was an accident or limit casualties in public statements, and try to reconstitute command functions quietly. That option maintains political cohesion short term, but leaves NATO operating blind in the most dangerous escalation environment since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Russia, meanwhile, faces its own decision point. Having demonstrated NATO vulnerability, Moscow can either consolidate this advantage through follow-on operations while NATO is still reeling, or pause and allow the political fracturing to do the work of weakening the alliance without additional military action. My assessment, based on pattern analysis of Russian operations going back to Georgia in 2008, is that Moscow will choose escalation. Here is why. The Kremlin has clearly decided that the current trajectory of NATO expansion and weapons deployments in Eastern Europe presents an existential threat that justifies accepting significant operational and economic costs to reverse. You do not execute a decapitation strike on NATO's Eastern Command infrastructure if you are looking for off-ramps. You do it when you have decided that the next phase of operations requires NATO to be operationally degraded before those operations commence. What comes next is not more posturing. What comes next is fait accompli territorial seizures designed to capitalize on the 72-hour window before NATO reconstitutes effective command and control. The next 24 to 72 hours will determine whether we are looking at contained crisis or the beginning of large-scale conventional warfare across Eastern Europe. Decisions being made right now as we speak in Moscow, in Brussels, in Washington will echo for decades. The Russian General Staff is calculating whether NATO's political will to respond with force can overcome the operational chaos their strike just created. NATO political leadership is calculating whether populist governments in Hungary, Slovakia, potentially Italy, will support collective defense measures when the very premise of collective defense capability just got shattered. And somewhere in the Pentagon, planners are running scenarios trying to figure out how to reconstitute Eastern Flank command functions before Russian forces exploit the window of vulnerability. Let me be clear about something that no official briefing will address. The United States has exactly two choices here, neither of them good. Option 1, immediate massive military response demonstrating that strikes on NATO infrastructure trigger overwhelming retaliation regardless of air defense failures. That option risks rapid escalation to nuclear threshold if Russia interprets the response as existential threat. Option 2, measured response focusing on reconstitution and defensive posture while seeking diplomatic off-ramps. That option concedes initiative to Russia and signals that NATO red lines are negotiable if Russia is willing to accept casualties and economic costs. Both options are bad. The question is which one is less catastrophic. And I do not have confidence that the people making these decisions are operating with the kind of clear-eyed analysis that the situation demands. What I have not yet told you is where this truly becomes dangerous on civilizational timescales. We are watching the real-time collapse of the post-Cold War European security order that has prevented major power warfare for 75 years. That order rested on assumptions about technological superiority, escalation dominance, and the credibility of collective defense commitments. Every one of those assumptions is now in question. When the assumptions underlying strategic stability collapse, you get rapid transitions to new equilibriums. Those transitions historically involve major warfare as competing powers test new boundaries and establish new hierarchies through force. We are not necessarily going to see World War III in the next week, but the mechanisms that prevented World War III for three-quarters of a century just stopped working, and nobody has a clear plan for what replaces them. The economic implications will hit global markets within hours of European trading opening. Energy futures are going to spike as markets price in potential disruption to Nord Stream alternatives and LNG terminals if escalation continues. Defense stocks will surge as European governments face domestic pressure to dramatically increase military spending. The euro will take a hit as capital flight to dollar assets accelerates, but these are second-order effects. The primary economic danger is that Russia, having crossed the threshold of direct strikes on NATO infrastructure, may calculate that escalating to targeting undersea infrastructure, satellite networks, or fiber optic cables that carry European internet and financial data presents acceptable risks. We are potentially 72 hours from cyber attacks and infrastructure sabotage that would make Colonial Pipeline look like a trial run. I wish I could tell you something more reassuring. I wish I could tell you that NATO has contingency plans for exactly this scenario, and those plans are being executed smoothly. I wish I could tell you that cooler heads will prevail and diplomatic channels will de-escalate before things spiral out of control. But I have been in enough military environments to know what operational chaos looks like, and what we are seeing is textbook chaos. Communication networks degraded, command structures decapitated, political leadership receiving contradictory intelligence assessments, military commanders being asked to provide options for scenarios they never seriously wargamed. This is how miscalculation happens. This is how limited strikes spiral into unlimited warfare. This is how we end up in places nobody intended to go because the mechanisms for controlling escalation stop functioning. The honest answer, however uncomfortable, is that we are in uncharted territory. The rules-based international order, whatever you think about its legitimacy or effectiveness, provided certain predictabilities about how major powers interacted. Russia just shredded those predictabilities. The question now is whether what replaces them is negotiated through diplomacy or imposed through force. My assessment concludes that force is more likely than diplomacy because neither side has acceptable off-ramps given current positions. NATO cannot accept that its eastern members are indefensible without fundamentally calling into question the alliance's purpose. Russia cannot accept continued NATO expansion and weapons deployments without fundamentally calling into question its status as a great power. When both sides have defined their positions in existential terms, compromise becomes politically impossible, even when it is strategically necessary. By the time you watch this, the situation may have already evolved beyond what I am describing. Information is fragmentary. Official statements are delayed and sanitized. What I am giving you is analytical assessment based on the best available information combined with pattern recognition from decades of watching how these scenarios actually unfold versus how officials claim they unfold. Take from that what you will. Cross-reference with other sources. Maintain appropriate skepticism, including of my own analysis, but understand that what happened this morning is not getting walked back. The threshold has been crossed, and everything that happens next flows from decisions being made right now by people operating under extreme pressure with incomplete information and limited options.